A 7-year-old boy sat completely still at the end of a long cafeteria table, staring at a cupcake he hadn't touched, while 30 children around him laughed, shouted, and chased each other between the rows of chairs. The cupcake had a single unlit candle in the center, blue frosting, his favorite color, according to the form his father had filled out at the beginning of the school year. Nobody had lit it, nobody had sung, and the boy, small for his age, wearing a button-down shirt that was slightly too big for his shoulders, simply sat there watching the noise around him, with the quiet patience of someone who had learned very early that waiting was easier than asking. His name was Felix, and somewhere across the room, near the gymnasium doors, his father was having the worst conversation of his life. Theodore Marsh had driven 40 minutes in traffic to make it to Felix's class party on time. He'd left work early, something he almost never did anymore, because Felix had circled the date on the kitchen calendar 3 weeks in advance, and drawn a small star next to it with a red marker. Theodore had seen that star every morning when he made coffee. He was not going to miss this, but the moment he'd arrived, the school's vice principal had pulled him aside with that particular expression. Careful, practiced, slightly apologetic, that Theodore recognized immediately. It was the same expression some social workers used. The same one doctors used right before they said something you weren't going to want to hear. "Mr. Marsh, I'm so sorry to do this today of all days, but we've been trying to reach you since this morning. There's been an incident involving Felix." Theodore felt the familiar cold drop in his chest. What kind of incident? Nothing physical, he's fine. But there was a situation on Monday with another student, and the other family has requested a formal meeting. Their attorney has already been in contact with the district. The words blurred slightly after that. Theodore stood near the gymnasium doors asking questions, nodding, rubbing the back of his neck, while through the small rectangular window in the door, he could see Felix's class party happening without him, without anyone paying attention to the boy in the slightly too big button-down shirt, sitting alone at the end of a long table. Theodore Marsh was 41 years old. He was a structural engineer for a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job that required precision and patience, and the ability to stay calm when things were structurally unsound. He had brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that were always slightly calloused from weekend projects he started to keep himself busy, and a habit of arriving early to things, because Renee had always been the one who ran late, and now that she was gone, being early felt like the only way he knew how to honor her. Renee had died 22 months ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. Felix had been 5, old enough to understand that mommy wasn't coming home, too young to understand anything else. Since then, Theodore had been running on something that wasn't quite strength, and wasn't quite survival. It was more like forward momentum. You keep moving because stopping means feeling everything at once, and feeling everything at once is not something the human body is built to survive before 7 a.m. On a Tuesday, he packed lunches, he attended school meetings, he learned how to French braid hair, badly at first, and then less badly. He read parenting books at 11 o'clock at night, with the focused desperation of a man trying to study for an exam in a subject nobody had taught him. Felix, for his part, was doing as well as a 7-year-old could do when the person who loved him most completely and instinctively was no longer there. He was quiet in ways that worried his teachers, he was precise in ways that surprised them. He collected facts about deep-sea fish, could name the pressure depth at which a human body would implode, and once corrected his second-grade teacher on the lifespan of a Greenland shark with the calm authority of a marine biologist, who happened to be missing his 2 front teeth. He had friends, technically, children who sat near him at lunch and didn't mind him, but the kind of easy animal companionship that most kids fell into naturally. The running, the shouting, the bumping into each other with total physical confidence, that had always been slightly out of reach for Felix. He observed more than he participated. He was more comfortable with facts than with unpredictability. And crowds, even crowds of children he knew, had a way of making him fold inward until he was very small and very quiet and easy to overlook, which is exactly what had happened at the class party. The party had started at 2 o'clock. By 2:15, the organized activities had dissolved into chaos, as they always do when you put 30-second graders in a room with juice boxes and no firm schedule. Children dispersed, Some ran, some screamed, some discovered that if you squeezed a juice box hard enough, it functioned as a projectile. Felix had watched all of this from his seat and made no move to join, and within minutes, without anyone intending it, the party had simply flowed around him the way water flows around a stone. Not hostile, not cruel, just indifferent. His teacher had noticed briefly, then been pulled into the juice box incident, then forgotten. His cupcake sat untouched. The candle remained unlit. That was when James Whitfield noticed him. James was 44 years old, and had no particular business being at a second-grade class party, except that his daughter Poppy was in the same class, and Poppy had made him promise, with the specific contractual intensity that 8-year-old girls reserve for promises involving parties, that he would come. James had rearranged his entire afternoon to be there. He was a high school history teacher at a school 20 minutes away, and he had the particular quality of attention that good teachers develop over years of standing in rooms full of people who are trying very hard not to be seen. He noticed things others didn't. He noticed the boy at the end of the table immediately, not because anything dramatic was happening. The boy wasn't crying, he wasn't causing a scene. He was simply sitting very still, in a room full of movement, with his hands flat on the table on either side of a cupcake he hadn't touched, and his eyes were doing that thing that James had seen in certain students over the years, that careful, cataloging observation that looks like calm, but is actually a very controlled form of loneliness. James looked around the room. He looked at the teacher, who was mopping something off the floor, near the windows. He looked at the other parents clustered near the snack table, talking to each other. He looked back at the boy, then he picked up his own cup of punch, walked to the end of the table and sat down. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. The boy looked up. He had dark eyes and a small serious face and the kind of careful stillness that suggested he was not entirely sure this was real. "No," Felix said. "Good." James set down his punch, "Because I've been standing over there for 10 minutes and honestly, it's kind of loud. You mind if I sit here for a while?" Felix considered this. "The average decibel level of a school cafeteria is around 85 decibels, he said. "That's roughly the same as a lawnmower." James blinked, then he laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one. "Okay, that's either the most interesting thing anyone has said to me all week, or the most alarming, possibly both." Something shifted very slightly in Felix's expression, not a smile yet, but the possibility of one. "Do you know a lot about sound?" James asked. "I know a lot about a lot of things," Felix said in a tone that was not boastful, just factual. "Okay, tell me something I don't know." Felix thought about it for approximately 2 seconds. "A blue whale's heartbeat can be heard from 2 miles away." "No way, it can." Scientists confirmed it in 2019. They attached a recording device to a blue whale using a suction cup. "A suction cup," James repeated. "They had to get a very big one." "This?" Felix smiled. It was small, and came from the side of his mouth, like he was still deciding whether it was allowed. James Whitfield had spent 20 years in classrooms. He had taught bored teenagers, grieving teenagers, furious teenagers, teenagers who were secretly brilliant, and had been told their whole lives they weren't. He knew, with the precision of long practice, exactly how to sit next to a child who had decided the world wasn't particularly interested in them, and make them feel, without any grand gesture or performance, that they were wrong about that. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't announce himself. He just asked questions and listened to the answers with the full, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be, and genuinely wanted to know. Felix talked about deep-sea fish. He talked about anglerfish, and the fact that the male anglerfish physically fuses its body to the female, and eventually dissolves into her, losing everything except reproductive capability, which Felix described as pretty sad but also kind of interesting. He talked about the Mariana Trench. He talked about bioluminescence, and how certain creatures create their own light in places where no light reaches. James listened. He asked follow-up questions. He shared the one ocean fact he knew, that the ocean is, in scientific terms, louder than most people think. And Felix informed him politely that he was correct, and that actually the loudest sound ever recorded in the ocean was the bloop, a mysterious ultra-low frequency sound detected in 1997 that scientists initially could not identify. "And then," James said. "And then they figured out it was an iceberg cracking," Felix said. "Which is less exciting but still pretty loud, Less exciting but still pretty loud, James repeated. That's the story of most things, honestly. Felix looked at him for a moment. You're a teacher, he said. It wasn't a question. History teacher, high school, how'd you know? You ask questions the way teachers do. Like you already know the answer, but you want to see what I'll say. James opened his mouth and then closed it again. That is an extremely accurate observation, he said. And kind of humbling. Sorry, no, don't be. It's a good thing. It means you pay attention. Felix was quiet for a moment. Then, my dad says that too. He sounds like a smart man. Felix nodded once carefully. He's out in the hallway. He's been out there a long time. James glanced toward the door. Through the rectangular window, he could see a man in a gray jacket talking to someone official-looking, running a hand through his hair, the specific posture of a person who is trying to stay composed, while something difficult is happening. What's your name? James asked. Felix, I'm James. My daughter's Poppy, she's the one who just hit someone with a balloon. Felix looked across the room to where a red-haired girl was gesturing expansively, while two other children recovered from an apparent balloon-related incident. She does that a lot, Felix said. Every single week, James agreed. It's her primary mode of affection. Felix made a sound that was almost a laugh. The candle on his cupcake was still unlit. James looked at it. He pulled out his phone, checked for a lighter app, found nothing useful, then looked around the table and found a small box of birthday candles in a plastic bag near the napkins. He also found, after a brief search, a lighter someone had left near the craft supplies. Presumably for the decoration station. Can I? He asked, nodding at the candle. Felix looked at the cupcake, then at James, then back at the cupcake. Okay, he said quietly. James lit the candle. The small flame caught and held blue and steady. I can't sing, James said. I mean technically I can produce sounds with my mouth, but categorizing them as singing is generous. That's okay, Felix said. I'm going to do it anyway. He sang Happy Birthday in the specific way that a man who cannot sing sings it in a loud room, slightly off-key, slightly too fast, with total commitment and zero self-consciousness. By the second line, Poppy had appeared from across the room, with 3 other children behind her, drawn by the spectacle of her father singing in public. They joined in, loud and tuneless and enthusiastic. By the time they reached the end, 7 or 8 children were clustered around the end of the table, and Felix was sitting up straighter, his face bright and surprised and completely unguarded in a way it hadn't been 20 minutes ago. He blew out the candle. The children cheered. It wasn't a big moment. There was no music swelling, no camera pulling back to reveal the full scope of what had just happened. It was a cupcake with a candle, a crooked rendition of a song everyone knows, and a little boy who had been invisible for 40 minutes and suddenly, briefly, wasn't. But it was real, and real is what stays. Across the room, the gymnasium door opened. Theodore Marsh stepped inside, still holding his jacket, still wearing the residue of the difficult conversation around his shoulders. His eyes moved immediately to the end of the table. He'd seen Felix through the window before the vice principal had finally released him. And what he saw made him stop walking. Felix was laughing, full, uncomplicated, out loud laughing, at something the man sitting next to him had just said. Poppy was showing Felix something on her hand. 2 other children were leaning in to look. It was a small, ordinary, cluster of children being children, and Felix was in the middle of it, not on the edge, not observing, but actually in the middle. Theodore stood there for a moment and felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't happiness exactly, though it contained happiness. It was more like relief so deep it bordered on grief, the particular ache of watching your child be okay when you had spent so long terrified they wouldn't be. He walked to the end of the table. Hey bud, he said. Felix looked up. Dad, you missed it. James can't sing at all. I've never claimed otherwise, James said, standing and extending his hand. James Whitfield, your son knows more about marine biology than my entire junior AP class. Theodore shook his hand. Theodore Marsh. And yeah, he does. He's been on a deep-sea phase for about 4 months. The anglerfish is genuinely disturbing, James said. Wait until he tells you about the giant isopod. Felix looked between them with visible satisfaction, the way children do when 2 adults they like are talking to each other. They stood there for a few minutes, Theodore and James, trading the careful, abbreviated shorthand of 2 fathers meeting for the first time, feeling each other out, finding common ground. James mentioned the high school, Theodore mentioned the engineering firm. James mentioned that Poppy's mother had passed 3 years ago. Theodore mentioned Renee. There was a brief silence of the specific kind that exists between two people who have lost the same category of person. Not identical grief, but recognizable grief, the kind that doesn't need a lot of explanation. She would have known exactly what to do in that situation out there, Theodore said, nodding toward the hallway, the meeting, the vice principal. She always knew what to say to those people. Yeah, James said simply. Mine too. Felix had drifted back to his cupcake and was now eating it with methodical focus, apparently having decided the social portion of the conversation was for adults and he was exempt. I saw him through the window, Theodore said quietly, so Felix wouldn't hear. Before I could get in, I saw him sitting alone and I couldn't. He stopped. It took me 10 minutes to get away from that conversation, and by the time I got in here he was already laughing. I don't know what you said to him, but I didn't say anything special, James said. I just sat down. Theodore looked at him. He's easy to talk to, James continued. Most adults just don't know it yet because they try to talk to him like he's a little kid and he's not, really. He's just a kid who knows what he knows and wants someone to be interested in it. He paused. Poppy was the same way after her mom died. Not quiet like Felix, she's never been quiet a day in her life, but she had this way of being in a room without actually being in it, if you know what I mean. Theodore knew exactly what he meant. You want to grab coffee sometime? James asked. I know that sounds strange after 15 minutes, but Poppy keeps asking for a playdate with Felix, and honestly, I think it might do them both good, and the coffee is mostly for the adults. Theodore looked at his son, who was now explaining something to Poppy with a cupcake in one hand, and 3 fingers extended on the other, clearly enumerating points in a way that Poppy was tolerating with visible patience and genuine interest. Yeah, Theodore said. Yeah, I'd like that. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way that stories sometimes suggest, where one event creates a clean before and after. It shifted the way light shifts in a room when you move a lamp 2 feet to the left. Same room, same furniture, but the shadows are different, and you notice things you didn't notice before. Felix started talking about Poppy at the dinner table. Specific things, what she'd said at lunch, an argument she'd had with a boy named Ezra, over whether sharks or crocodiles were more dangerous. Poppy had argued crocodiles, Felix had informed her she was objectively correct, and she had high-fived him with the intensity of someone who had been waiting all her life for validation from a marine biology expert. Theodore noticed that Felix smiled more when he talked about her. Not the careful, considering smile he gave adults, but the reflexive, unguarded kind. Theodore and James got coffee on a Thursday morning before school. Then again the following week. It turned into a standing thing, the kind of friendship that forms between two people who are both a little tired and a little behind, and recognize something in each other, without having to say it explicitly. James told Theodore about the first year after his wife died, the specific practical catastrophes, the casseroles from neighbors, the performance of managing. Theodore told James about the French braiding and the parenting books and the particular exhaustion of trying to be both parents at once, and feeling constantly like you were doing neither one well enough. You're doing it well enough, James said. Felix told Poppy you're the best dad in his class. Theodore looked up from his coffee. He said that, word for word, Poppy told me last night. James shrugged. Kids don't lie about things like that, they don't have the social motivation. Theodore was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he circles dates on the calendar. When something's important, he circled his class party 3 weeks out. I know, Poppy said, he told her. I almost didn't make it. I almost let that meeting eat the whole afternoon and I almost. He stopped. I was standing in that hallway for half an hour, looking at him through the window. But you made it, James said, you were already there. Different thing. James said simply, you got through the door. It was a small thing to say, but it landed the way small things sometimes do, cleanly, with weight, in the exact place that needed it. By spring, the 4 of them had established a loose, comfortable rhythm. Saturdays at the park near James's school, where Poppy ran at full speed into everything, and Felix provided detailed commentary on whatever he'd been reading that week, and Theodore and James walked behind them at the pace of people who were not in a hurry for once. Movie nights at one house or the other, chosen by democratic vote that Felix almost always won, because he had the most clearly articulated preference and the patience to argue it. Felix had joined an after-school science club. Small group, quiet environment, children who liked facts. He'd made 2 friends there, real ones, the kind who texted him about shark documentaries on weekends. His teacher noted in the spring conference that his participation in class discussions had increased markedly, that he seemed more settled, more present. Theodore signed up for a grief support group, not because anyone made him, but because James had mentioned offhand that he'd attended one for a while. And it had helped more than he'd expected. Theodore had thought about it for 6 weeks before going, and the first night he sat in a circle of strangers in a church basement and said Renee's name out loud. In a room full of people who understood exactly what that cost, he cried in the specific way he hadn't allowed himself to since the funeral. Without composure, without management, without worrying about what it would do to Felix to see him fall apart. He drove home feeling lighter than he had in 22 months. Some losses don't heal. That's a fact that nobody says plainly enough in the early days when everyone is bringing casseroles and saying things will get better, as though grief is a linear process that ends. Theodore knew by now that it didn't end. Renee was not coming back. The space she had occupied in their house, in their routines, in Felix's understanding of what it meant to be loved without condition, that space remained. You didn't fill it, you learned, over time, to live with the shape of it. To let it coexist with good things. To let the good things be good without it feeling like a betrayal. On Felix's 8th birthday, Theodore made exactly the kind of party Felix asked for. Small 6 kids. The science club friends and Poppy and 1 boy from the neighborhood. Homemade decorations that Felix had designed in advance with engineering precision, and Theodore had executed with considerably less. A chocolate cake with blue frosting, made from a recipe that had been Renee's, and that Theodore had made every year since because some traditions are worth the grief they carry. James and Poppy came. James helped Theodore hang the decorations that hadn't quite cooperated. Poppy organized the children with the focused energy of a small red-haired general who had found her battalion. When they sang Happy Birthday, it was loud and slightly off-key, and James was the worst of all of them, as promised. Felix blew out his candles. He had 8 of them this time, 1 for each year. He closed his eyes for a moment before he blew, and Theodore watched his son's face in the candlelight, that small, serious face with the dark eyes, and he thought about the boy sitting alone at the end of a cafeteria table with an unlit candle, and the man who had simply walked over and sat down, and how everything that followed had grown from something that small, a question, a cupcake, a terrible rendition of a simple song. Felix opened his eyes. He blew. Every candle went out. The room erupted. Kids yelling, Poppy throwing her arms up, James making a sound of exaggerated triumph, as though Felix had just completed some enormous feat of athleticism rather than exhaling in the direction of a cake. Felix laughed, full and unguarded and real, and Theodore, standing just to the left of the cake, with a lighter in his hand, and tears he was not going to acknowledge, understood something that success and efficiency, and the relentless forward motion of grief had never taught him. You cannot engineer your way through love. You cannot optimize presence. You cannot outsource the moment when someone who is small and quiet, and sitting alone at the end of a table, needs you to simply walk over, sit down, and stay. It costs nothing. It changes everything. If you've ever been the person sitting alone, or the person who walked over, share this with someone who needs to remember that kindness doesn't require a reason, a plan, or a perfect moment. Sometimes it just requires a chair.